This video is brought to you by Incogni. While many of our viewers probably assume that all pensioners are home-owning millionaires, the UK is in fact currently facing its worst pension crisis in decades, with around 2.1 million, or 18%, of all pensioners in the UK living in relative poverty. So in this video, we're going to take a look at why the UK has one of the worst pension systems in the developed world, why pensioner poverty is on the rise, and why it's expected to get worse in the coming years.
Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos.
So, quick primer. In the UK, there are two types of pensions. You have your state pensions, which are paid by the state and go to basically everyone once they reach 65, and then private pensions, which are set up by individuals or employers and subsidised by the government. Until relatively recently, the UK actually had some of the worst pensioner poverty in the developed world. This had a lot to do with Margaret Thatcher's government, which introduced a set of policies to reduce the burden on the state, including the creation of private pensions. Thatcher argued that it was unsustainable for state pensions to increase against whatever is higher, wages or inflation, as happened in the 60s, and thus she reformed the system so that state pensions were only linked to inflation. Pensions duly fell against wages, and nearly 3 in 10 pensioners were living in relative poverty by 1994. At the turn of the century, a series of reforms were introduced to reverse the trend, perhaps the most important of these being the triple lock, introduced in 2010, which ensures that state pensions have to rise by one of three things: earnings growth, inflation, or 2.5%, whichever is highest. In summary, this basically reversed Thatcher's policy. And in 2012, an auto-enrollment system was introduced for private pension schemes. It was a great success, raising the proportion of employees saving into private pensions from 32% in 2012 to 75% in 2021. Not only did this reduce the strain on government spending, but private pension funds also became massive investors in UK assets like stocks, bonds, and property, boosting the wider economy. These measures were widely hailed as a success, and pensioner poverty duly began to fall in the 2010s. Unfortunately, in the past few years, it started rising again, reaching nearly 18%, a 4% rise from the past decade. The poorest 20% of retirees have an income below the living wage, leaving around £41 weekly for food. Over a third of pensioners renting privately are in poverty, with higher poverty rates among ethnic minority pensioners. So, what went wrong? Well, it's in part because, as controversial as this might be to younger generations, the triple lock doesn't actually go that far. Even though the triple lock increased state pensions by 8% this April, most new retirees living exclusively off the state pensions are still close to the relative poverty line, and the UK state pension is actually one of the worst in the developed world. In 2022, the UK's net pensions replacement rate was 54.4%, below the OECD average of 61% and the EU average of 68.1%. And in regards to private pensions, the TLDR is that many Britons can't or won't save enough for retirement. Worryingly, recent data suggests around 2 in 5 working-age people are currently not saving enough to meet the minimum target for an adequate retirement income. Now, this might sound counterintuitive, given that we've just mentioned that more people than ever are enrolled in some form of private pension scheme, but progress here has been undermined by the Pensions Freedoms legislation, introduced by George Osborne in 2014. The legislation allowed anyone over 55 to use their pension cash however they liked, and enjoy a tax-free withdrawal of 25% of it. The policy was accompanied by a bunch of economically right-wing rhetoric about pensioners' freedoms of choice. Then Pensions Minister, Liberal Democrat Steve Webb, said at the time that the government wasn't that concerned if pensioners get a Lamborghini and end up on a state pension. That is their choice. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Osborne's pension freedoms has led to many people taking too much from their retirement pot too early, leading to a complete exhaustion of their retirement funds. The Financial Conduct Authority found that only 35% of individuals who cashed in early saved the money, whilst 47% used it for large expenses. And it's not just high earners splashing out or middle earners taking a bit out for a cheeky holiday, but increasingly lower income households taking money out to cope with the cost of living. About a quarter of those aged over 55 had drawn down their pension to pay off debt last year, up from 22% the previous year. In more bad news, there are a number of reasons to think that things are only going to get worse. First, stagnant wages. Stagnant wage growth is a big issue since retirement income depends on savings accumulated over working life. But in the UK, the average UK worker hasn't actually received a significant real pay rise since 2007. Second, the UK's ageing population. In 1999, 1 in 6 of the UK's population was over 65. But by 2019, it will be 1 in 5, and by 2050, it's set to be 1 in 4. Now, this is a problem because if you have less young people but more old people, then you have less people paying taxes relative to those being supported, and this will really strain the national budget. In fact, spending on state pensions is already expected to rise from 5.1% of the current national income to 6.4% in 2050. Pressures on the health and social care budgets are even larger, set to push up spending from 9.5% of national income today to 13.6% in 2050. Now, broadly speaking, there are 2 ways the government could relieve this pressure on the national budget. Firstly, abandoning the triple lock, or secondly, raising the state pension age. The government has, for now, pursued the latter, raising the pension age to 67 between May 2026 and March 2028, and many analysts expect further rises in the future. But this will again only hurt the poorest in society, who generally have lower life expectancies, raising worries that many won't even get to see their pensions. And it's not even clear if this is a sustainable solution. A report by the IFS has said that even with a state pension age of 70, spending on a triple lock state pension would exceed a set cap by 2050. So at some point, not imminently, the government may decide to scrap the triple lock. One way or another, the way things currently stand, it seems that the most vulnerable in society will be getting the sharp end of the stick. While you've been watching this video, you might not realize that shady forces in the background are trying to collect your personal data from various sites, bundle it together, and sell it to a third party. These data brokers can then sell your information to anyone from a company to an online criminal. Now, you might assume that you're always safe online. Perhaps you regularly change your password or even unsubscribe from annoying email newsletters that you don't even remember signing up for. Unfortunately, this doesn't always save you. Companies that hold your data can still fall victim to a data breach, meaning that these data brokers can still compile all of your information and sell it on to others. The good news is, you have the right to protect your privacy and request that the data brokers delete your personal information. But the bad news is that it would take you years to do it manually, and even then, you need to repeat the process every 3 months, as data brokers continue collecting your data. Luckily, this is where our sponsor Incogni comes in. Incogni reaches out to these data brokers on your behalf, requests that your data is removed, and deals with any problems that might arise. Even more, Incogni is persistent and will put in multiple data removal requests even after your data has been removed to make sure it doesn't go back on the market. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, by using our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.